The rain against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Chicago high-rise sounded like static. A dull, relentless hum that swallowed the noise of the city below. The temperature in the executive boardroom had dropped a few degrees since the sunset, leaving the air brittle. I sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, the glow of my laptop screen cutting harsh angles across the dark wood. 56 tabs were open. 3 separate mezzanine debt structures cross-referenced against 5 years of sanitized EBITDA reports. The numbers were bleeding together, but the discrepancy was there. A manufactured financial crisis. I closed the main ledger file, the click of my mouse the only sharp sound in the vast room. Across the table, Amelia rubbed her left temple. It was a tight, circular motion. The gold of her watch caught the dim light as her hand dropped. She was still wearing the structured navy blazer from the morning's press briefing, but her posture had lost its rigid armor. The silence between us wasn't empty. It was heavy with the weight of a $70 million deficit that didn't mathematically exist. She exhaled, a shaky, uneven breath that seemed to pull the remaining oxygen from the room. I didn't say a word. I just reached into my briefcase, pulled out a fresh legal pad, and uncapped my pen. Amelia Daniels was 39 years of inherited pressure. The CEO of a commercial real estate empire that her grandfather built and her uncle was currently trying to sell for parts. I was 30. I was the external forensic accountant hired by a minority shareholder group to find out why the firm was suddenly bleeding cash. Over the past 6 weeks, my job description had quietly shifted from auditor to the only person in the building she doesn't have to manage. She looked up, the exhaustion in her eyes stark against the severe lines of her face. "They moved the board vote up," she said, her voice lacking its usual commanding cadence. "Charles just sent the memo. We have exactly 14 days before the restructuring committee forces a liquidation of the prime assets." Her uncle, Charles, the man who smiled for the cameras while quietly structuring toxic debt covenants behind her back. I kept my eyes on the spreadsheet, highlighting a buried liability clause on page 42 of the vendor contracts. 14 days is enough time, I said, my tone flat, grounded. I didn't offer empty reassurance. I offered logistics. We need to isolate the shell companies he used to funnel the operational budget. Once we have the routing numbers, the liquidation vote becomes a fraud hearing. Amelia let out a dry, humorless sound. She stood up, walking toward the rain-streaked window, her silhouette framed by the grid of the city. I noticed the slight unsteadiness in her step, a tremor she was trying very hard to hide. The hotel logistics mistake happened 3 days later. We were supposed to be attending a mandatory compliance summit downtown, a 2-day marathon of regulatory theater. Sarah, Amelia's overworked assistant, had booked the accommodations through the corporate portal, right as the firm's accounts were temporarily frozen by Charles's legal maneuvering. The result was a single, sprawling executive suite booked under the firm's name. No secondary rooms available within a 10-mile radius due to a massive tech convention. We stood in the center of the living area, the plush carpet absorbing the sound of our luggage wheels. The suite was massive, all grey slate and minimalist furniture, but the proximity immediately shifted the air in the room. Amelia dropped her leather tote onto the sofa. She looked at the single set of double doors leading to the bedroom. "I can sleep on the couch," she said, her voice tight, immediately reverting to problem-solving mode. "Or I can call Sarah, have her find a motel in the suburbs. It's fine. I just need to review the Q3 projections before the morning panel." I watched her tighten her grip on her phone. She was vibrating with a specific kind of high-level panic, the terror of a woman who was never allowed to stop moving. I set my briefcase down by the entryway. I didn't look at the bedroom. I looked at her. "You're taking the bedroom," I said, keeping my volume low, a deliberate counter to her rising pitch. I sleep fine anywhere, but neither of us is working on Q3 right now. You haven't eaten since 6 a.m. She blinked, the sudden pivot in logic throwing off her rhythm. I have a protein bar in my bag. I'm fine, Daniel. She wasn't fine. The dark circles under her eyes were bruised into her skin. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened an app, and placed the device face down on the glass coffee table, a deliberate severance from the digital noise. My older boss whispered, "My hotel room is completely empty," I said, my voice entirely devoid of humor, presenting it as a dry fact. And I replied, "Then let me bring you dinner. I'm ordering from the Italian place down the street. Chicken or steak?" A fraction of a second passed where she just stared at me. Then, the rigid line of her shoulders dropped about half an inch. The fight drained out of her, replaced by a profound, heavy fatigue. "Chicken," she murmured, sitting down on the edge of the sofa. "Thank you." I didn't turn it into a moment. I just nodded and walked to the kitchenette to pour her a glass of water. The tension in the suite didn't vanish, but it reorganized. It shifted from the frantic energy of a corporate crisis to the quiet, steady hum of functional survival. Over the next hour, the storm outside worsened, rain lashing against the high-rise glass. When the food arrived, we ate at the small dining table. I kept the conversation strictly on the parameters of the audit. I talked about asset depreciation schedules and the specific legal thresholds for fiduciary breach. I used the dry, sterile language of my trade to build a wall of safety around her. I didn't ask her how she felt about her family betraying her. I showed her the exact spreadsheet rows where I was going to dismantle them. She listened. A fork paused halfway to her mouth, and for the first time in weeks, I saw the tight lines around her mouth relax. The competence was the anchor. I didn't need to hold her hand. I just needed to prove that the ground beneath her wasn't going to collapse. The routine settled into our days like poured concrete. We returned to the office, the 14-day clock ticking down. My paralegal, Remy, sent over the encrypted bank logs from the Cayman accounts. "This is a mess, Gray." Remy's voice crackled over the secure line. "Charles didn't just hide the debt. He cross-collateralized it against the firm's pension fund. If he triggers the default, the employees lose everything, and Amelia takes the public fall." I stared at the dual monitors on my desk. Find the original loan origination documents. Charles had to sign as a guarantor. Find his signature. I spent the next 3 nights in the archive room, a windowless bunker on the 12th floor. Amelia would come down around 9 p.m., bringing 2 black coffees. She would take her heels off, leaving them by the door, and sit on the floor surrounded by bankers' boxes. The domesticity of it was entirely accidental, a byproduct of the siege we were under. One night, she fell asleep against the side of a filing cabinet, a highlighter still gripped in her hand. I stopped typing. The room was perfectly silent except for the hum of the HVAC unit. I looked at her, at the sharp angle of her jaw relaxed in sleep, the slight crease between her brows completely smoothed out. I wanted to wake her up and tell her to go home. Instead, I quietly took the highlighter from her hand, draped my suit jacket over her shoulders, and turned back to my laptop. I stayed up the entire night, running a recursive algorithm through the digitized contracts until my eyes burned, specifically so she wouldn't have to look at them tomorrow. The midpoint shift happened on a Tuesday. The hidden contract clause activated. Charles didn't wait for the board meeting. He leaked the preliminary restructuring document to the business press. The headline hit the terminals at 10 a.m. Legacy firm insolvent. Amelia Daniels expected to resign amidst debt scandal. I was in the middle of cross-referencing a ledger when I heard the commotion in the outer office. I walked out to find reporters already gathering in the lobby, the security guards overwhelmed. Amelia was standing by Sarah's desk, staring at a tablet screen. Her face was entirely drained of color. For a woman who controlled rooms with a glance, she looked entirely hollowed out. A camera flash reflected off the glass doors. Without a word, I stepped between her and the glass, physically blocking the line of sight. "Sarah, lock the elevator bank," I said, my voice carrying no panic, just instructions. "Amelia, walk with me." I guided her into her private office and shut the heavy oak door, instantly cutting off the noise of the floor. The sudden silence was absolute. She stood in the center of the room, her hands trembling. "He triggered the covenant," she whispered, the realization hitting her like physical force. "The clause in Section 4. If public confidence drops below a certain metric, the bank can call the loan immediately. He leaked it to force the bank's hand. It's over." She covered her face with her hands, a single, shaky exhale breaking through her composure. I didn't offer a motivational speech. I didn't tell her it was going to be okay. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. It wasn't a romantic embrace. It adhered strictly to the principle of the quiet room. The moment my arms enclosed her, I focused entirely on stillness. I locked my muscles, creating a rigid physical barrier against the chaos outside the door. I didn't stroke her hair or pull her flush against me. I just stood there, an immovable object, absorbing the tremor in her frame. The physical act was a shield. Gradually, the frantic rhythm of her breathing slowed, syncing with the steady, slow rise and fall of my chest. The silence in the room stretched, heavy and functional. When she finally stepped back, the panic in her eyes had been replaced by a cold, hardened clarity. "What do we do?" she asked. "We don't play his game," I said, stepping back to give her space. "He's relying on you panicking and resigning to save face. He thinks you'll take a severance package to avoid the fraud hearing." I walked over to her desk and opened my briefcase, pulling out a thick, bound dossier. But Charles made a mistake in the routing logic. He assumed the mezzanine debt was untraceable. He didn't know I spent the last 3 days auditing the origin point of the shell companies. I slid the dossier across the desk. He didn't just collateralize the firm's assets. He used his own personal equity as the secondary guarantee to secure the lower interest rate. If the firm defaults, he loses his estate, his personal accounts, everything. He built a bomb and handed you the detonator. The climax arrived in the boardroom on a Friday. The room was packed. Charles sat at the head of the table, flanked by the restructuring lawyers, wearing the calm, patronizing smile of a man who believed he had already won. Amelia sat at the opposite end. I sat to her right, my laptop closed, a single manila folder in front of me. Charles called the meeting to order, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Amelia, my dear, we all know this is difficult, but the market has spoken. The bank is calling the loan. For the sake of the family legacy, the board requires your immediate resignation and the authorization to liquidate the commercial properties to cover the shortfall." He slid a separation agreement across the table. "It's the only responsible choice." Amelia looked at the contract. She didn't reach for a pen. She didn't look at me for permission. She placed her hands flat on the mahogany table, her posture flawless. "I decline," she said, her voice ringing with absolute, terrifying authority. A murmur rippled through the lawyers. Charles's smile faltered. "Amelia, you don't have a choice. The bank..." "The bank isn't calling the loan, Charles," I interrupted. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a scalpel. I didn't look at the lawyers. I looked directly at him. I opened the manila folder and slid a single sheet of paper down the table. "Because the debt has been purchased. Yesterday afternoon, a private equity group, acting on behalf of an anonymous principal, bought the entirety of the firm's mezzanine debt at a premium." I watched the color drain from Charles's face as he read the document. "I read the buyout contract you drafted," I continued, demonstrating the exact trap he had missed. "Section 9, paragraph 4. The guarantor clause. You tied your personal assets to the debt to secure the rate. The new debt holder is calling the loan, Charles. But they aren't calling it on the firm. They're calling it on you. You have 48 hours to produce $70 million, or your personal estate is seized." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. It was the sound of a carefully constructed empire collapsing inward. Charles looked up, his hands shaking. "Who?" he choked out. "Who bought the debt?" Amelia stood up. She didn't gloat. She didn't raise her voice. She simply executed her agency with flawless precision. "I did," she said, "using the liquid capital from my mother's private trust, which you conveniently forgot I had sole access to. I own the debt, Charles, which means I own you. You will resign from this board effectively immediately. You will sign over your voting shares to me, and you will leave this building. Or I will authorize the seizure of your assets by close of business today." It was a total, systematic dismantling. No yelling, no theatrics. Just the cold, measurable application of leverage. After the paperwork was signed and the room cleared, leaving only Amelia and me, the tension finally broke. She stood by the window, looking out over the city. I walked up behind her, maintaining a respectful distance. She turned to me, reaching out, and our hands met. It wasn't an intertwining of fingers. It was the transfer of stability. The tremor that had lived in her hands for weeks finally stopped. The world stopped spinning. We attended the press conference later that afternoon together. She stood at the podium, announcing the restructuring of the board, and when a reporter asked who would be managing the firm's internal audit moving forward, she didn't hesitate. "My partner, Mr. Gray," she said clearly, looking right at me. It was a public choice, a line drawn in the sand. Closing thoughts. I learned that true safety in a relationship isn't about someone fighting your battles for you. It's about someone handing you the right tools so you can win them yourself. Real love isn't dramatic. It's the quiet consistency of showing up day after day and making the load lighter. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.